So we're continuing our Guardrails series today, and I've been getting feedback from folks through the weeks, and everybody's starting to recognize that we have guardrails now out on the road. They're driving on the road. They're saying, hey, I've noticed that we have guardrails. I never noticed before. And one family, the Greenhorns, actually sent me, they went to the zoo with their kids, and they sent me this picture, which is at the zoo, which I thought was great. It was a sign on a guardrail. Hazard, stay off the guardrail. I don't know if that's a lion pit or the tiger pit, but whatever. It's not only, it's warning you to just stay away from the guardrail altogether. And I thought, if there's ever a topic where we need to have a sign in addition to the guardrail, it's today's topic. And we're going to talk about that. I actually thought about posting online on Facebook yesterday. I said, come to church tomorrow. We got sex, subs, and Super Bowl. You know, we could just advertise that way. And then I thought, no, everybody on the outside of the church would not understand that, So I refrained from that, sense a little bit of humor yesterday. But we are talking about guardrails, and we're talking specifically about this area of sexual desire and sexual behavior. So we're going to be talking about that here today. Let's remind ourselves, though, what a guardrail is. A guardrail is a standard of personal behavior that becomes a matter of conscience. Let's read that together. A standard of personal behavior that becomes a matter of conscience. Now, Paul in Corinthians is saying to us this morning that very same thing. And he says it, I'm reading out of a different version than what we read already, but in 1 Corinthians, the very first verse there that we read said this, you say I'm allowed to do anything, but not everything is good for you. One of the things that Paul was communicating to the church was that, there's a lot of things we can do that's permissible for us to do, yet not everything is beneficial. My daughter came to me when she turned 17 last year, and she says, Dad, I can go see R-rated movies now. And I said, yes, you can. You can. That's permissible. You can go. You're allowed to go see an R-rated movie. But I would say that I would not recommend you go see all R-rated movies. Not all of them would be beneficial for you to watch. It's permitted, but it's not beneficial. Or when we turn 21, we say, now I'm of legal drinking age. Yes, it's permissible. It's legal for me to go drinking. But if I have a family history of alcoholism, it might not be beneficial for me to do that. And so we have to think about, yes, there are things that are permissible, but not everything is beneficial. There are things that we can do, but not everything is good for us. One of the things that was going on in Corinth was prostitution, was legal, permissible. It was like Las Vegas, it was permissible. And Paul's saying, it may be permissible because there were Christians in the church saying, hey, why can't we do this, Paul? Everybody else is doing it. What's so wrong about this? It's permissible. There's nothing, nobody's saying we can't do this. They might even said like we do, well, I have a right to do this. It's my body. This is what I want to do with my body. And so there's a lot of that thinking that's going on even in the first century as well as the 21st century. And what Paul's saying is, you might be allowed to do that. It might be permissible. It might be okay by society's standard, but it doesn't mean it's beneficial for you. It doesn't mean it's good for you. It doesn't mean it's going to help you. And so we have to think about that. I'm also reminded, even as we spend this Super Bowl Sunday, and I kind of wonder how I got stuck with this topic again this year on Super Bowl Sunday. It just happened to work out that way. I tried to pawn it off on the associate pastors, but they kind of looked at me and said, no, Matt, we think you ought to do this. How convenient. So it was supposed to be last Sunday, so it turned out to be this Sunday. And one of the things that happens on Super Bowl Sunday, as you may remember, we talked about this last year, this is one of the highest sex-trafficked Sundays of the year. The Super Bowl attracts sex trafficking, the sex traffic trade. We're not talking about women who choose to go into that trade. We're talking about women who are forced into that trade. 12-year-old, 13-year-old, 14-year-old young women who are runaways from home that are enticed into this and then forced into this type of trade to survive. And that's going on in New York City right now. And that happened yesterday, and it's going to happen today, because when all these men come together, and especially men who don't have guardrails in their lives, who don't know how to put guardrails on that area of temptation in their life, they succumb to this temptation, and that's what makes this possible. So we do need guardrails, and we need to look at this in terms of guardrails. Now, the word that Paul uses here, what's translated sexual immorality, in some translations it's translated fornication here, is the word porneia. The Greek word porneia. Now, what other word do we get? What comes to mind when I say porneia? Pornography, right. So Paul's talking about pornography or porne. That's where we get the word pornography. But he's talking about more than just the image. He's talking about a whole realm of sexual behavior, sexual immorality. It's a very broad term that he's using it here. And the best translation is actually sexual immorality as it applies to our sexual behavior. Now, the scripture actually mentions he actually brings up two of the strongest drives within each of us. There are two very strong drives within us that are wired within us. The first one is the drive for food, to eat, to satisfy our stomachs, because we need food to survive. And so that's a drive that is within each of us. The other drive that is very strong within all of us is our sex drive, the drive to create and to procreate, to go forth and multiply, as God said to Adam and Eve. Because that's a very strong drive, and that God gave it to us, and that's a good thing. These are good things because they help us and survive. They help us survive, and they help our humanity, our species, to survive and to continue on. So those are good things. The issue is when those things get out of bounds, when those areas of desire start to take over in other ways that are unhealthy for us. And so we have to manage those drives. Now, the difference is that if I overindulge, at a dinner or at Christmas, which I'm guilty of doing, I can do things to correct that, right? I can go on a diet, I can exercise, I can try and eat differently. Even if I indulge in an area, I can recorrect that. In the area of sexual desire, if we indulge in those areas, we're not able to correct that. In fact, we're left with regret. And those are I think some of us have, some of our biggest life regrets are in this area for us. And here's the other thing I want to say about this. We have a God that forgives us and loves us and extends grace and mercy to us. And there is no regret, no shame, no guilt that God can't overcome in our lives, that God can't heal, that God can't forgive. And so keep that in mind even as we're talking this morning, that God's grace is bigger than any regret that we have in our life. And that applies to all our Guardrails series. As we're thinking about some of life's regrets, know that God's grace is greater than our regrets and can do that, work in us and heal us from those regrets. So as we're looking at this, I came across an article last year entitled Hooking Up. I don't know if you're familiar with this, but there's a phenomenon going on college campuses now called hooking up. Now, hooking up means something totally different than it meant to me when I was growing up. But what it means is that there's no longer any dating that's going on between couples, that the dating is off the table. It's just, and sometimes even acquaintances are getting together, they're hooking up, and they're getting involved sexually with each other without having any relationship with each other. No dating relationship, no relationship development. Psychologists are very concerned about this for both men and women and the psychological impact of this and what's happening to young men and women as they're going off to college and they're engaging in this. So there's an expectation that this is going to happen for young people. That's the kind of the sad part about it. I was reading one article, and this is what a female college student from New York, a college in New York said. She said, "If I or my friends had the opportunity for real relationships, we'd take it. But my generation hasn't really been conditioned for it." Wow, that's sad. It's sad because what she was reflecting in the rest of the article is like, I am expected to behave this way from men and women. And I'm not able, but if I had a relationship, if I could have a real relationship with somebody, I'd take it. We'd jump at it in a heartbeat. But maybe our generation doesn't even know how to do that anymore. So I think about that. Remember, we've talked about how the cultural drift and how things change from generation to generation. And so I think that's what's happening in our culture. You can see this idea that what's happening is we're taking physical intimacy and replacing it for relational intimacy. And we're thinking that if physical intimacy will meet my need for relational intimacy, and that's just so backwards. It's actually relational intimacy is what we all need. We need the relational intimacy, and if we have good relational intimacy, we're going to have very good physical intimacy. Does that make sense? So it's a byproduct, almost a bonus, a benefit of relational intimacy. But what's happening is we're switching them around. We're saying we can have, what that generation is saying is we can have the physical intimacy without the relational intimacy. That's not how God created us. That's not how we're wired psychologically. But that's where we're going with this desire. This is where this desire can take us. That's a danger zone for us to go into. And so I could also point out what a lot of people don't talk about in society is the benefits of being in a committed relationship and having physical intimacy within a committed relationship, which we call marriage. And there are tons of benefits to that that nobody's talking about, and we could unpack. And I would have to get a little bit more explicit to unpack that, so I'm not going to do that. But go, email me, and I'll show you I'll give you the links to different things. But here's the thing. Here's a question. When's the last time you saw two happily married people in a love scene in a movie? When's the last time you saw two happily married people in a love scene in a movie? Not in a Cialis commercial, in a movie. Think about that, right? Our media, our world does not portray the greatness of the marriage relationship, both relationally and physically. It promotes an idea that's only good if you're not married. And that is so far from the truth. That is so false in so many ways. And that's, again, I don't want to get explicit. I said I wouldn't get explicit. So think about this. Don't ask me. Well, you can ask me, but I'm embarrassed to tell you this. I watched the bachelor wedding last Sunday night. So, and the reason is because I have two teenage daughters that if there's anything wedding related on TV, it gets recorded on the DVR. So I actually didn't watch it live. I, watched it a little bit later, and we sat down and watched the wedding, and this live wedding. But what I thought about when I was watching it was how much they made a big deal out of this idea, because in this wedding, this couple decided to wait until they were married before they were physically intimate with each other. And the media people were like covering that like it was like the biggest story since the O.J. Simpson trial. It was like this is a big deal. And I remember watching some people interview them like, we don't understand. We can't fathom this. What are you talking about? What's leading you to do this? And I thought, wow, we've come so far the other way that we think this is abnormal, that this is wrong, that this is like, we can't even understand that. And I thought, wow, that's craziness. But that's really where our culture is. That's what our culture is pushing us towards. So we need to set a guardrail in this area of our lives. One, because it's a very strong desire within us, right? It's an area of temptation for us, and it's stronger temptation than some other areas. And number two, our culture is not going to set the guardrail for us. Our guardrail, we can't look to our culture to set our guardrails in this area of our life. They're not going to help us here in any way, shape, or form. So the Apostle Paul knows this. And so he knows the cultural pressures. I mean, think about that in Corinth. They had the same pressures we do. They had the same sex drive that we do, and they had the same cultural pressures that we do in the 21st century and the first century. So Paul sets a very clear guardrail, and it's a very simple guardrail. You want to know what that is? It's very simple. Run. That's it. That's all you got to remember. Run. So whenever you fall into temptation in this area, you know what you need to do? Run. That's right. That's what he says. Run from sexual sin. No other sin so clearly affects the body as this one does, for sexual immorality is a sin against your own body. And that's really where we could get into some psychological impacts of this immorality and how it impacts us in our bodies. And so we don't understand that in the pursuit of this temptation, we're actually doing damage. Paul actually goes on to say, not only are we as Christians, if we're a Christian and a follower of Christ and we put our faith in Christ and we're in Christ, not only is he saying, are we damaging our own bodies, we're damaging the body of Christ when we do that. And he used such strong language that he says, it's like taking Jesus and having Jesus be with a prostitute. That's the strong language he's using about our sexual immorality. He's saying, not only are you hurting your own body, you're hurting the body of Christ when we do that. Again, maybe we ought to do a whole series on this and just unpack a lot of that, but again, it would go on. So we've got to run. We've got to stop flirting and start fleeing. Flee, baby, flee is the title. Get out of there. Run as fast as you can. Get out of the situation as fast as you can. We have to do things to help that. Again, I always ask people for personal illustrations that I can use in sermons. Nobody wanted to volunteer for this one. So I'm at home. We upgraded our FiOS. We have Verizon FiOS, and they give you $10 more a month. You get upgrade to the higher speed internet. And I find out when I upgrade to the higher speed internet, there's even a higher speed internet I could upgrade to after I'm like, what? So anyway, so I'm on there, and then with the upgraded internet speed, I got free HBO for a year, right? Cool. There's like 10, 12 movie channels, kids movies, family movies, regular movies, catching up on some old movies that I hadn't seen. And so, Saturday afternoon, I'm having my lunch, flipping channels, come across this drama, this crime drama. Is Woody Harrelson and Matthew McConaughey, and it's an intense crime drama, and I'm getting pulled into it, and it's, because they're really great actors and good crime drama. And I'm sitting there watching as I'm eating my lunch, and all of a sudden they switch scenes, and there's this woman in this scene with Woody Harrelson. And I'm used to watching other channels where they go to commercial, where they cut the scene, they edit out the stuff and they leave it up to your imagination. Remember those days when that happened? And so I'm thinking they're going to, I'm watching this go on, and I'm going, they're going to cut, they're going to edit this, they're going to go to HBO doesn't have commercials, by the way. I knew that. But here's the thing, and this is the temptation, this is the issue. And I think this is true for both men and women, that we are visually attracted to things and to people and to physical images. And so, and I think this is particularly challenging for men because of the way we're wired. And so once we see that image, it's like a moth to a flame. And it's hard to stop looking, is what I'm saying. And I'm just being drawn in, and then I'm and that's going on, and I'm thinking about this, and now I'm looking at this image that I really shouldn't be looking at, and they're showing a lot more than I thought they would show, and so I'm being sucked into this. And this is why if you're ever at the beach, with a guy and they kind of do one of these when somebody walks, that's part of what's going on. It's just part of the wiring. Or if you're at a restaurant and there's a woman dressed a certain way that walks by, a guy will kind of do one of those. It's because of that. Now, again, not an excuse. Just explaining the way we're wired. I'm not saying that we should do that. Boom. You get ready. So this goes on. And I don't always get this right, but I finally caught myself and I said, Matt, you need to change the channel. So I changed the channel to something else, go to Sports Center, something like that. So you switch channel, and you think, okay, great, victory in Jesus, all right, you got it, you dealt with it. So is there anything more that I need to do? I had a matter of conscience, a guardrail that kicked in, my conscience got affected, I acted on that guardrail. Was that enough? No. So I called up Verizon, and I said, I need you to take HBO off of my account. I don't need those channels on my TV. And the guy on the phone's like, why would you do that? It's free. You don't have to pay for it. And I'm like, I wanted to say, I'm paying for it, all right. So you don't know how I'm going to pay for it if it doesn't come off of there. So, but I basically said, it's not about the money. It's not about what's free. It's about the content that you're bringing into my house. And I don't want that content coming into my house for multiple reasons. But really what I needed to do was I needed not just to have that matter of conscience. I needed to cut off that temptation from my life. Does that make sense? And that's what needs to happen. So the other thing about that is I want you to notice something. I was willing to sacrifice something that was free to me, that belonged to me, so that I could set up this guardrail. When Joseph was caught in the clutches of Potiphar's wife, he ran away from that temptation as quickly as he could. And you know what he left behind? His coat. He sacrificed his coat, which was very valuable to him and valuable in that culture. He was willing to sacrifice that so that he would not be in temptation. And that's what I'm saying, is that sometimes we need to be willing to sacrifice and make sacrifices to things that we should be able to do or be able to have or be able to think about, and be willing to give those things up because we're trying to put up a guardrail. You know, men come to me sometimes, they say, well, I'm struggling with this, with the internet, and what's on the internet. And I basically want to say, get rid of your computer. Get rid of it out of your house. And they say, well, I need it for work. Well, then leave it at work. Use your computer at work. Don't have a computer in your home. If it's that big of a temptation, if that's not able, and there are other things you can do, but if it's that big of a temptation for you, get rid of it out of your house. Don't have access to it. Maybe have your wife, your kids have access to it, they can log into it with their code, but it's off limits to you if that's what you need to do. What I'm saying is there are sacrifices we need to be willing to make sometimes to set guardrails in our lives. Does that make sense? Okay. Because what happens when we engage in this imagery is we're actually trading physical fantasy intimacy for true relational intimacy. And we're trading it, and in a sense, what's happening, the analogy I've used before is it's like we're trading a steak dinner for a bag of Doritos. You know, those Dorito commercials going to be on TV tonight, getting you to buy Doritos and do all kinds of crazy things to get your Doritos, which is really the same thing with this area of our lives. But the thing that will satisfy us the most and that will be the best and the greatest will actually be the steak dinner that we can have when we have relational intimacy that leads to physical intimacy. And that's part of that. The other thing that I think we need to have a protection on is that one of the leading causes of divorce is extramarital relationships. People that go outside the marriage relationship to get needs met, either relationally or physically. And it happens both. We can go get relational needs met beyond our marriage. We can go get physical needs met beyond our marriage. And that can do damage, severe damage to our marriage commitments and our relationships. And then when you do damage to the relational intimacy, what do you think happens to the physical intimacy? It gets damaged as well. And so we have to be aware of that. And it's very hard to undo that damage, to rebuild that trust that's been broken. That's a very difficult thing to do. So here's a great quote from Andy Stanley. I think it's a great quote, and I wanted to share it with you. Great romance in marriage is fueled by a sense of exclusivity. Great romance in marriage is fueled by a sense of exclusivity. When I marry couples, and they stand there at the beginning of their wedding, I say to them, I ask them each a question. Oh man, I forgot now. I can usually do this in my sleep, but it basically goes like this. For better, for worse, for richer, for poorer, forsaking all others, will you be faithful to each other as long as you both shall live? Forsaking all others, all other people, all other images, all other things, will you forsake all others for as long as you both shall live? Does that make sense? For the rest of your life. That's exclusivity right there in our marriage vows. How many people say we should keep our promise? How many people think you should keep your promises? Yeah, we all believe that. We all agree to that. Yet when we get married, that's what we're promising. We promise each other exclusivity. And what we're saying to that person is, you are going to be the number one. You are going to be my priority. You are going to be exclusively mine and nobody else. It's just you and me. We're in this together. And when we experience that, I am telling you, it is so much better than all the other non-exclusive stuff we can do. If we value and keep that exclusivity, it is great. 23 years of marriage, I can tell you, it's a great thing. And great romance is fueled by exclusivity. The other thing about this is sometimes I know what happens is we tend to drift apart in our marriage relationships. Here's what I want you to do. Go on a date. Because what does dating do? It's relational. It builds relational intimacy. And relational intimacy leads to physical intimacy. But it's the relational intimacy that needs to be protected, that needs to be guarded, that needs to be valued, that needs to be invested in, that needs to be fueled so that there is great romance. That's what we're protecting. So, some tips as we wrap up here today. They may sound a little bit off to you, off the wall, maybe a little extreme, but again, if we need 8-foot girders in the ground on guardrails for other areas, we need 16-foot girders on this one. And we need signs on the guardrails saying, stay off. because that's how strong this desire is. For married people, I'm going to talk to married people and single people. Married people, don't travel alone with members of the opposite sex. If at all possible, don't travel alone with members of the opposite sex, especially if it's someone you're attracted to or get along really well with, or can, are in a relation, having a good relationship with, because that creates an area of temptation that you maybe aren't planning. But a lot of temptations aren't ever planned. They're not, we never think about temptation as, oh, I'm going to go ahead and do this. It's usually little incremental things along the way that lead to that place. Number 2, don't eat alone with members of the opposite sex. Now, there are times when I do eat with members of the opposite sex, but I usually do it in a public restaurant. My wife knows it's happening. My wife knows what the agenda is on that lunch, because what am I doing? I'm not hiding it. It's not a secret. My staff knows where I am. My wife knows where I am, so they know what's going on. And it's that secrecy that leads to temptation. And once we break that secrecy, we can do that. Some of us, we maybe just need to stay out of that area altogether. Number 3, don't confide in or counsel members of the opposite sex. A lot of times what happens, I see this pattern, especially in extramarital affairs or extramarital relationships, is that we start to go to somebody of the opposite sex and we start to share things with them about our marriage and maybe something that's wrong with our marriage. And anytime we do that with someone of the opposite sex, what we may not realize we're actually communicating, hey, I might be available. If I'm unhappy in this marriage, maybe I'm looking for another relationship. So that can get interpreted that way and can lead to temptation. Again, it's always the incremental things. We don't go from 0 to 60 in a second or 10 seconds. We go for little step here, 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 and then over time these things happen. So we have to set up guardrails that keep us from those areas, from those things that are happening. And number 4, when you feel your heart or desire drifting towards someone else, tell someone about it. I would say if you feel your heart or desire drifting towards something else or someone else, tell someone about it and set some boundaries. Once you recognize that's an area of temptation or a place of temptation, start to put some boundaries on it. Set some guardrails around it so that you don't fall into that temptation before you get into it. I've said this before. I say this to young people. Sex is like a water slide. Once you start going down the water slide, it is very hard to stop. So the key is, don't get on the water slide. Don't sit down in the water. You can look at the water. You can't look at it either, but you can be aware that the water slide exists. But once you get on it, once you start getting into that, it gets very hard to stop. If you ever tried to stop yourself going down a water slide, good luck, right? Because that's how strong that desire is, all I'm saying. It's not that you can't, it's just very strong. It's very hard to do. So single people, number 1, apply the married people guidelines in your relationships with married people. Honor their commitment to somebody else, even if you don't know who that somebody else is. So, and what we're doing is we're doing to others what we hope they would do for us. So that if one day we ever are married, we would want the same type of treatment for our own marriages. So think about that. So just be aware of that. Honor that commitment they've made to somebody else and honor that. And then number 2, no sleepovers. Sleepovers are for kids. I know today's age, young single adults are having sleepovers. And they'll say to me, well, we're not doing anything. There's nothing going on. We're just hanging out together all night. Well, again, we're creating the temptation. We're putting the possibility of temptation there, and we can stop that temptation by just not doing that behavior, just setting a guardrail there and say, that's not something I'm going to do, in my relationship, because I want to preserve the relational intimacy and the physical intimacy of my spouse, whether it's currently or in the future. So you may be thinking, Matt, you're crazy. You're just expecting too much of us. You're prude. These are too extreme. Well, Aristotle observed that when a carpenter wanted to straighten out a warped board, so a carpenter would pull a board out of the pile and it would be crooked, be warped. So what the carpenter would do would actually not straighten it, but bend it and clamp it in the opposite direction of the warp or the curve, knowing that if he held it in place for long enough, when he took the clamps off, it would be straight. So it wasn't just enough to straighten it, you had to overcompensate for it. Does that make sense? And I think in this area of our lives, we need to overcompensate for it. This is where we need to overcompensate with our guardrails because it's such a strong temptation. And Paul reminded us in another book, he says, do not be conformed to the pattern of this world, but be transformed. Be changed. And that's our challenge here in this area. Amen.